Hello, you are someone, and I am someone else. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And today we are going to be doing a review on Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Thomas Sowell. Okay, so Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Thomas Sowell. I have finished this whole book. I did read chapter 1 on my channel. If you want to read, if you want to listen to chapter 1 and a guy struggle to read, go ahead and listen to that. My reading voice is absolutely horrible. That was a months ago. But if you want to listen to me read, go ahead. It's on my freaking channel. I mean, whatever. But we are going to go through the table of contents and we are going to talk about this book. I found this book to be quite a fascinating read, to be honest with you. Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, revised and enlarged edition by Thomas Sowell. Okay, here we go. The contents, table of contents, prefix chapter. Chapter 1, issues. Part 1, so just part 1's like a group of chapters. Part 1, geographic factors. Chapter 2, waterways. Chapter 3, lands. Chapter 4, culture, animals, and diseases. Part 2, cultural factors. Chapter 5, cultural and economics. Chapter 6, cultural diffusion. Chapter 7, culture and progress. Part 3, social factors. Chapter 8, population. Chapter 9, mental capabilities. Part 4, political factors. Chapter 10, political institutions. Chapter 11, politics and diversity. Chapter 12, the welfare state. He says some very interesting things about the welfare state. He says that, okay, we'll talk about that later. And then part 5, which is the last part of the book, and there's 4 chapters. It's Chapter 13, economic differences. Chapter 14, implications and prospects. Chapter 15, causation versus blame, and Chapter 16, goals. And he says the welfare state actually has a lot more to do with the poverty of Americans. They create the wrong incentives for Americans. So, like, you could probably tie Chapter 12 and Chapter 15 together because, like, honestly, they kind of have the similar methods, basically. And Chapter 15, he says that Black Nigerians, well, I think nearly every Nigerian is black, but whatever, right? Black Nigerians actually make their children and them make more wealth than an average black American. Now, that's a very controversial statement, and he talks, well, it's truthful, but it's controversial in some regard because he says if it's a legacy of slavery and it's a legacy of institutional racism that's causing this wealth divide, then how is it that an immigrant group that supposedly looks similar to the people who live here is doing a whole lot better? And he says that for some reason there's some sort of, maybe some sort of cultural thing going on, some sort of stigma going on that's causing these natives or these people that are born here to not do as well as the immigrants. Maybe the immigrants are more appreciative of the work they do, and so they're going to save every last dime or whatever. Like, there could be a list of incentives that's maybe driving one group of people over another. I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but basically he's like, why would you blame slavery when a group of people who also may have experienced slavery in Africa, let's be real, there was plenty of slavery going on in Africa, is doing a whole lot better in the United States. And, while they're not descendants of slaves or whatever, but, they still, for whatever reason, are doing a whole lot better than the people who live here in the United States. Now, I don't know the proper reason for that, but again, he claims that the immigrants are somehow producing more growth to the economy than the average American. And I actually kind of agree with that. I mean, you think about Jeff Bezos, perfect example, right? Elon Musk, another example. They're either children of immigrants, like Elon Musk is an immigrant, or or Jeff Bezos is a child of an immigrant. He was raised by a single mother, but his father was a Cuban immigrant. Think about it. In every circumstance, he seems like the most disadvantaged person. But when you look at his background, Jeff Bezos, right? Because obviously he's the richest person in the world, or one of the richest, right? But you look at his background, he built $1 trillion enterprise and got to keep, what, $200 billion of wealth? So what he did was he produced $1 trillion of wealth and kept about a fifth of it. He sold off most of his business to other investors in the market. So he diluted his shares. So he doesn't control all of Amazon. Does that make sense? And that's what he talks about in the book. He talks that why would you blame rich people who didn't tax? They didn't get the money by stealing, by taxing. No, they got money by voluntarily making a company, voluntarily handing out employment contracts, voluntarily doing all this stuff. It's a lot less forceful than taxing like a politician does. And politicians don't produce as much in the economy compared to private enterprise most of the time. So they can spend and they can technically boost GDP that way. But all it is mirrors and smoke, like F.A. Hayek says. Keep going back to F.A. Hayek, but all it is mirrors and smoke. Keynesian economics doesn't really work because it ignores one fundamental principle, that human psychology cannot change the resources in an economy. And you cannot dictate human action by government action. You just can't. Which is why I'm a big fan of Liebman von Mises, but that's a whole nother thing. That's a whole nother theory. Human action, economics is so different from Thomas Sowell. Like, I don't know if I could even compare them. But I am an Austrian economist, and reading Thomas Sowell has really got me thinking that maybe I should focus more on the resources side, instead of human action side of things. And so that is why I'm really a big fan of Thomas Sowell. He gets me thinking so differently from other economists, and he's so, another example. Bill Gates. Bill Gates was probably raised by two middle class parents, and he was given some capital by his parents to start his business. He obviously had some luck, but what he did was he was a really smart software developer, and he sold his software to governments around the world. And so nearly every single operating system, every single government operating system is Windows. So you go to most computers, except for North Korea maybe, but you go for most computers in the world. I mean, China, Russia, they all use Microsoft. I'm probably collecting data off those countries, which is kind of sad, but whatever. There's private companies collecting data, which they're probably not supposed to, but I would not be surprised if we are. That being said, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics was just a great book. And Goals, I read it only just 2 days ago. I forgot most of the book, to be honest with you. But Waterways was a really good chapter. He explains exactly why Africa is poorer than Europe in this book. If you want to know why Europe is way richer than Africa, this book is perfect to explain. Or even the United States. The United States has probably the best geography on the planet. Not just the institutions that make the United States rich. No, you look at the geography just all by itself. We have this coastline that is so easy to defend, and it's so easy to predict trade with it. It's so easy for our government to overdo trade. So we're able to produce a lot more wealth here than in Africa, sadly. It's great that I live here, but the people in Africa, it's terrible because their waterways aren't as navigable. It's just, that's what the book says. And he says, there's another book called Why Nations Fail. And he disagrees with that whole book. He says, poverty is the normal human condition. The things that need to be explained is wealth. Wealth needs to be explained because wealth is basically a standard of living that most people will never get to experience. And so that is what he's trying to get at. He's trying to study what wealth is, not poverty necessarily, although he's trying to explain why nations are poorer than other nations and why this mindset that you could just build wealth by increasing minimum wages or having government intellectuals and influence the economy is wrong. That it happens organically with people voluntarily trade. And he talks about a really good quote, I think. He says something about money. I think it was in another one of his books. Probably wasn't in this book. It was probably in Economic Facts and Fallacies. That money is basically an incentive for you to produce wealth in some ways. or it's like a thing that shows your production level in a unit unit of currency or whatever, right? Which again, like it kind of sucks to people hate to be valued by their worth, by their production in the economy, but Thomas Sowell, the way he thinks about it, is the economy is efficient. So as a Chicagoan, he believes that the efficient market hypothesis, if you make your money legitimately, the market is pricing it most likely efficiently. I disagree with that. I think I'm more of a too much cost fallacy. I'm a John Bogle guy, but John Bogle's a Keynesian, kind of. He's kind of more of a John Mark Keynes kind of guy. I am personally not a big fan of John Mark and Keynes. But I follow John Bogle, so I know a lot about John Mark and Keynes with John Bogle's books. And I have read John Mark and Keynes, and I don't remember anything in that book. But anyway, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. Chapter 16 is named Goals, and he talks about, like, these are the goals that these intellectuals want, or whatever. Or, like, we should be trying, I forgot exactly what he said. I'll go back into the book, and let me see if I can find goals. Prosperity is widespread, even not... When prosperity is widespread, even not equalized, maybe a significant dose worse. He does say, oh, this is about negative income tax rates. That's really good. So one of his goals is to have a negative income tax rate instead of income distribution. And I actually really like that as one of his goals. What is he talking about? He also says that income distribution is clearly not working. Another thing. He also talks about affirmative action in many countries. I think he talks about this. I'm not 100% certain. With like universities and stuff. And affirmative action doesn't seem to be working. Whenever they do it, what it does is it doesn't incentivize hard work as much. Like, let's say your test scores, let's say SAT scores are, 800, right? And these guys are getting 900, but you go in because you have a certain, you're part of a certain group, a certain ethnicity, right? And then you drop out because the college is slightly faster paced than what you expect. Sure, your test scores are amazing, but for that college, you are not the right fit. You could have done way better at a little bit of a slower pace at a different college and would have gotten that degree, and you would have never failed. And that's really what he talks about. Thomas Sowell, again, like, he always thinks like this is what the input seems like a good idea, right? When the input's fine. It's the output that destroys any semblance of wealth. It's the output that these intellectuals don't realize, that while they want to craft the world in their own image and they want to make the world a better place, in doing that, they've created a bad incentive that will perpetually make generations of Black Americans or whatever groups he was talking about in Wealth, Poverty, and Politics forever poor. Because you did not create the right incentive structure. It's not the fact that the intellectuals didn't try. I'm sure that they did in some regard. It's the fact that the policies that they're advocating for is not working. And in fact, it's doing the opposite. Welfare has not worked. Giving money to people has not worked. They are not incentivized to get a job. Clearly, it's not working. A single mom, if they raise their income, they get taxed all their income. It doesn't work. You need a negative income tax rate in order for to upset that thing. You cannot build a welfare system on that. Like, I don't know. That's my opinion. I think if you have a kid, if you're a woman anyway, negative, 25% on all your income for the rest of your life. After 4 kids, 100%. All your income will not be taxed. And you'll be making way more than a man, offsetting all if you have 4 kids. That's what I personally would advocate for, as like an economist. I think that we should try the best to get the government away from our families, or away from individuals. And the best thing we do is having negative tax rates on certain things to incentivize certain behaviors like having kids, or because our population is declining. We don't have enough kids in this country. Or what's another policy I was thinking about? Like, for instance, trade with China. I think we should increase as much trade as much as possible with China, barring the fact that we should not be giving away our intellectual property to China. Right? For the most part, China and us should be as most dependent as possible, because the more dependent we are on China and the more dependent China is on us, the less likely we're going to go to war, and the more likely that world peace will happen sooner. And so that is why I believe we should have as much free trade as possible with China and less aggravation with China, like, less military action with China and stuff like that. Now, obviously, China's not going to let that happen because we are the world power, and they want to be on the top. But the problem is the Chinese worldview is not as compatible as the American worldview, I feel like, because with the Americans, at least most people outside the United States can understand a little bit of English. I mean, not all of them, but, like Argentina, 40% of Argentinians can speak English pretty well, right? Most people, India, another perfect example, about 20 to 30% of them probably speak English probably better than I can. I mean, they're not natives, it's their second language, but they could speak it better than me. Because they learned it through the British system. We always, as Americans, we always say, oh, the British speak better English than us. And in that regard, because their language is technically closer to England, I guess, we always say that the British speak better English. But that's probably not true, because the American accent's actually older than the British accent. And in fact, it's older than pretty much all the accents of all the English accents. The American accent is. In fact, I think he actually talks about them with poverty politics. Again, there's so many subjects that I'm so fascinated by in this book. He brings up so much facts that I couldn't even do the book justice. He has 90 pages, by the way, of sources. Like, I gotta say, I would have to say, this is all his sources. My little finger right here, about half of my finger is sources. That is ridiculous. I am not reading all those sources. But if you want to, you could go and check all the sources. And he says if there's any mistakes, blame him. Don't blame his editor. His editor is the one who actually sourced all his stuff for him. So, but in that, he did say in the last few pages, he's like, oh, here are my accommodations for my editor and all this, my wife. And he talks about, the people who helped him make the book, or people who supported him for all the time in the world. So, in that sense, I respect Thomas Sowell. I mean, I have the Thomas Sowell Reader, which is probably, if you want to really get a sense of who Thomas Sowell is, get the Thomas Sowell Reader. But their Charter Schools and Enemies is a really good one too. Charter Schools and Their Enemies. Again, Applied Economics is probably my favorite economics book he's ever written. Applied Economics. I do have Basic Economics. I have read all of Basic Economics. However, I do not recommend this. However, there is one chapter I think everyone should read in this book called Price Controls. In fact, I will read that chapter. One day I will read that chapter on this YouTube channel. I will read chapter 3 because it talks about why socialism will fail. It is probably the best chapter. It's called Price Controls. But what socialists want is free stuff. But that is giving a price control on something that costs money. If you give it for free, that means it's zero. Zero, it doesn't cost anything. But the government, it clearly costs something for the government. So clearly you can't really have price controls, theoretically anyway, right? It has to cost something. The labor, the doctors, they want doctors to get paid a lot, but then people don't want to pay for medicine, so it kind of equals out. It's an equilibrium, hopefully. In some countries, like in the UK, doctors get paid not the best compared to other countries in the UK, or in the United Kingdom, but in the United States they make way more money. But a lot of the people in the United States don't get medical insurance because we're supporting the European healthcare with our healthcare insurance by giving them cheap medicine, using our healthcare. But that's in applied economics. That's a little too advanced. But that's why it's called applied economics. It's applied to certain industries. That's why the book is called that. And that's why I love that chapter on healthcare. I will read that one probably too. That one's really good. The healthcare chapter, it really explains a whole lot on why a private healthcare system is actually more efficient than a public healthcare system, but it's very cold-hearted. If you don't have the money or the time, you're not getting healthcare. Um, public system, you wait outside more. You wait outside in the cold until your doctor shows up. With a private healthcare insurance, you're paying so many bills. A doctor will most likely show up if you're willing to pay enough money. So I mean, again, like both sides of the argument is like maybe we should have a mix like Australia does. But anyway, that's besides the point. I shouldn't be talking about that. A little too complicated. But yeah, apply. I shouldn't be talking about apply economics. I should be talking about wealth, poverty, politics. And in the wealth, poverty, politics, I'm so I get so caught up in. It's a fantastic book. He talks about in chapter 4 he talks about the Native Americans. So there were people that lived in the United States before the Americans, obviously the Europe, the what like my ancestors or other people's ancestors who were involuntarily or voluntarily chose to come here, right? My ancestors voluntarily chose to come here. There was hyperinflation in Germany, and I exist because of that, right? Because of 1922, there was they moved in, I think, 1922. They moved to Germany, the U.S. Anyway, that's my ancestors, right? Because the Weimar Republic had hyperinflation, but other people obviously had a different experience. They were brought up on ships and they were forced to work. And again, they looked entirely different, obviously, right? But the natives had it much worse because what the natives had was a complete societal collapse because they didn't have horses, they didn't have cows. This is what wealth, poverty, and politics talks about, and so those things do build wealth. Yes, they do, and they actually increase population a lot more than what the natives had. Natives had some cities that were bigger than Paris, some cities that were bigger than most European cities, but they didn't really have enough animals to prevent disease, right? We would have introduced animals before we showed up on the shores, and they would have built a natural immunity, and let's say it was 100 years and they stole those animals, they probably would have remained on the continent. But because we showed up with the animals and we decided to invade, it killed off 90% of the people were just wiped out by disease automatically. And so this left off 10% left to be hurt by the European invaders or whoever showed up in the United States, whoever was going to show up. And he talks about actually the biggest mistake in history was the Chinese emperor in, I think, 1446 or something. I forgot the year. But in the 1400s, the Chinese emperor says, we're burning down any ship and all records of traveling. And that basically doomed the Chinese civilization to that little spot in Asia. I mean, that big spot in Asia. It's not little, but that big spot in Asia, right? Because if the Chinese would have explored the Americas, I think the natives actually would have survived longer, first off. And secondly, the Chinese would be one of the most powerful countries today. If they didn't have that very executive culture, that very exclusionary culture that China has today, if they would have had that in the 1400s, the exploring culture like the Europeans did, they would be a whole lot wealthier than they are today. I genuinely do believe it. I think that Europe would have actually fell behind if that would have happened. There would have never been as European colonialism in the Americas, not as bad as it was in this timeline, but an alternate history, obviously. But it is, that quote that was literally a big giant quote in the wealth, poverty, and politics, all by itself, one big quote. The biggest mistake in history was Chinese emperor, and that really like think about it, an alternate timeline. Like, I should just make a video series alone on that freaking quote. But I'm not going to because I can't predict the future. I don't know a whole lot about history to think about that quote. But, like, there's so many things in this book that, honestly, just pick it up and just, honestly, don't get basic economics. It's too big. I would get it on Audible, but if you have time, but don't just get the physical book. It's too big. In my personal opinion, if you're a big Thomas Sowell fan, yes, get basic economics. It will explain everything about the economy. But in my opinion, you don't need basic economics. Apply economics will work great. Economic Facts and Fallacies has some of the best quotes in that. I still am reading it. I'm halfway through Economic Facts and Fallacies. But the quotes in that book are actually better, I think, than any of his other books. I'm actually impressed by it is a beginner level book, in my opinion, of economics. Like it's better if you had no knowledge in economics, honestly, to go into that book. By the way, I have finished nearly all the John Bogle books. I'm on this one. I've finished every single one of these books on this shelf right here. So I've finished nearly every single John Bogle book that I own. There are one or two that I'm missing. However, I don't want to read a whole lot more John Bogle, to be honest with you. So when I get older, I might decide to finish up the John Bogle just readathon, but I just don't have a lot of space on the shelf. And I got like the Soviet Constitution. I have a bunch of these books now. Look at all these constitutions I have. I mean, I got the Federalist Papers. I got the Anti-Federalist Papers. Like, I'm sorry, I'm showing off my books, but that's what my live stream will be about. By the way, I will have a live stream next month on the 25th. Next month, I forgot what next month is. It was either May or something, June or something. I forgot what month it will be. But anyway, you are someone, I'm someone else. I hope you enjoyed my little rants about this book or my explanation. Oh, by the way, I should rate this book. I give this book, I think subjectively, I give this book maybe a 7 out of 10. Because it's very subjective. He's very anti-welfare. So if you're like a socialist and it hits you hard in the gut, this book does not give you. Oh, another thing. I just thought of this. This is one of the most impressive things. Cuban immigrants produce more GDP than the entirety of Cuba. Cuban immigrants in the United States produce more GDP than all of Cuba. That's a good fact in there. That's the last fact I'm going to bring up in that book. There's so many more, but I just don't have time to bring up this whole book. Okay, you are someone and I am someone else. Again, I just read Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Thomas Sowell. Goodbye.